10-minute record reviews, episode 87. And this time we're going to talk about Black Sabbath's debut from 1970 on Vertigo Records, Black Sabbath. So this is the 2016 remaster. It is also of the US version, so there's no Evil Woman on here, but there is Wicked World. So this album is the birth of heavy metal. Other people might make certain claims for other albums along those lines. I think what all those claims have in common is that they're completely wrong. You can tell it's the birth of metal because all of the overly intellectual hippie rock critics from the late 60s and early 70s who heard this panned the hell out of it. So Lester Bangs says, oh, it's just like Cream, but worse. Robert Christgau says, it's bullshit necromancy. They were falling over themselves to proclaim this as dumb and derivative. It's laughable to think of this album being considered as derivative when this album is absolutely foundational for an enormous, not just genre, but a series of subgenres of music going forward. And its style and its sound and its subject matter were all innovated pretty much independently by the members of this band. So this is the foundation point. This is where it all begins. This band all came from Birmingham. Ozzy was a ne'er-do-well, did every single kind of possible menial job there was. He was mainly a burglar. He got arrested for really stupid crimes like stealing baby clothes and trying to sell them in a pub. Finds his salvation basically through music because he wasn't going to be up to much else. Tony Iommi also was a working class kid. He picked up the guitar at an early age, became quite proficient. Famously, at the age of 17, as he was leaving his job at a sheet metal factory, was involved in an accident and cut the tips off two of his fingers, his fretting fingers. Takes the, frankly to my mind, incredible step of making himself prostheses by melting down a dishwashing liquid bottle and forming little plastic tips for his fingers. And not only does he learn how to play, he founds an entire genre of music, one of the more amazing stories in music history. Bill Ward, local kid, gets into drumming, listening to a lot of swing bands when he was younger, people like Gene Krupa and things like that. And Geezer Butler, who has a bit of an unusual CV, training to be an accountant, being really interested in the works of Aleister Crowley, the occult Satanist who also influenced Jimmy Page, and also being a hippie. Geezer and Ozzy had been in Rare Breed, Bill and Tony had been in Mythology. The four of them get together in 1968. Their first band name is Pocatulk Blues Band, and they changed their name to Earth, which is not a favorite of all the band members. They're hanging out at the rehearsal space and they look across the street and there's a movie theater, and the movie marquee is showing the film by Mario Bava, the French sort of gothic film director, called Black Sabbath. They start writing lyrics which are the musical equivalent of the cinematic experience of going to a horror movie. And so the song Black Sabbath gets written. They like the song and the title so much they brand themselves Black Sabbath as well. They gig around Birmingham in 1969 with a sound which is clearly now heavier than pretty much any other band was playing at the time, due largely to Tony's use of rhythm guitar essentially as the lead instrument in the band, which sounds kind of paradoxical. But when you hear their music, how all these songs are based around riffs, you realize that the other instrumentations are obviously important, but it is the riff which becomes the signature sound of the band. Ozzy had a cold going in, and that too contributes very much to the sound of the album. There's a hoarseness and a roughness to the way he sounds, which I think totally suits the material. Recorded in a day, it took about 6 or 7 hours to record the main tracks, another 2 or 3 hours for overdubs, and then they were in the pub. All done in a day, the music world shaken up, and the music world didn't know it yet. Quite an achievement for a bunch of working class guys with little formal musical training, who had suffered, amongst other things, prison time and an industrial accident along the way, but went forward to remake their own landscape. I think we have to now just talk about the first few seconds of this album. The rain falling, the church bell tolling, the sense of anticipation that you feel when you're listening to this and you're not quite sure for the first time what you're going to hear. It's of course the song which uses the tritone, the so-called devil's interval. And a little sidebar on that, there's a lot of pseudo historiography about this in Sabbath world, about how this was something which would get you excommunicated by the church in the Middle Ages or so on. Sadly, it's not that dramatic. But the tritone was used occasionally in early modern music, and then increasingly from the classical period on for its dissonant quality. A side note here about a couple of other minor innovations that are, I guess, Tony Iommi-isms. One of which is the use of palm muted distorted riffing, which is so common that it's hardly worth a mention in contemporary heavy metal, but was a new thing then. And also his use of hammer-ons as well in the last note of the main riff. There's every reason in the world to think that this is just a dumb song with dumb lyrics, it's cartoonish and so on. And yet, the band plays it totally straight. And because they play it totally straight, it works. It is spine-chilling, it's spooky. It then, of course, has an absolutely kick-ass coda with some wonderful riffing and just an incredible crescendo to the song. Ozzy's vocal performance is, he may have equaled it at other times in their career, but he never surpassed what he did here in this very first song. When that song is over, you know where you are, you know what you're listening to. A large percent of the audience, the potential audience, I'm sure, has bailed out at that point, but if you've decided to stay, then you are in for the duration. Followed by The Wizard. This is an unbelievably heavy track, and getting back to what I was saying about Tony's use of rhythm as lead, it is those crunching riffs which totally drive the song, not just during the verses, but also during the chorus. That's what you hang on, that's what you remember from the tune. Then you have the medley on side one, which starts off with Wasp with that kind of interesting riff at the beginning, which includes strumming entirely open strings and guitar. Then you're on to Behind the Wall of Sleep. I used to think this was a drug song, but I gather it's actually based on an H.P. Lovecraft short story about a prisoner who is dying and is having visions, and there's a doctor who's trying to figure out why he's dying and why he's having visions, and eventually gets access to this guy's dream state and learns that there's some life behind, quote, the wall of sleep. Bill does a great job using that great funky style of his of tying those different pieces of music together. His music fades out, the bass fades in, and Geezer's playing basically, which is this very kind of unstructured, very much a first take feeling kind of a bass solo, which starts off loud and then slowly fades out and then fades right back in with that beautiful, wonderful, distorted bass riff that starts off NIB. This is a song which Ozzy sings from the perspective of the devil. Sabbath are actually a bit hard done by when it comes to their association with the devil. Let me mind you, they traded off this as well. But there are actually very few songs which are pro-devil or pro-hell or pro-damnation in the Sabbath oeuvre. This, I think, arguably is maybe even the only one. And in fact, on their next album, Paranoid, they have a song which is explicitly pro-Christian and anti-atheist. So I don't think you can make any kind of claim these guys are some sort of monochromatic Satanist band. That's actually the rarity. They're playing with ideas here. And anyway, none of that matters because this song begins and ends with this riff, which is superb. Side 2 on this version, the US version, starts off with Wicked World. This is where I think the album starts to get a little unfocused. I mean, I love this album. I love almost every second of it, and it's totally under my skin. But I think if I were coming to it without that degree of commitment, I might describe the solo on Wicked World as a bit of unstructured noodling that could have used some editing. There's worse to come. The rest of side 2 is given over to an extended medley / jam. So a bit of finger is essentially just a few seconds of somebody playing on a Jew's harp, doing, doing, doing thing. Then that leads into Sleeping Village, which starts off with this great Sabbathy, slow as you can get it, ponderous kind of a riff. And then once the one verse of lyrics is over, you then have an extended improvisation by Tony, overdubbed at some points with himself with a second guitar track. Then we segue into the only true cover on this album, which is Warning by the Ainsley Dunbar Retaliation. Ainsley Dunbar, by the way, is a guy who played with absolutely everybody. John Mayall, Bowie, Lou Reed, Jeff Beck, and Rod Stewart, the founding member of Journey. Dunbar had been ejected from John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and he started up a band called Ainsley Dunbar's Retaliation, kind of as a joke. They do this song called Warning. It's barely recognizable. Geezer's bass line in particular, you really can't hear if you listen to the original. And I think the bass line here, that brooding, intense bass line that he lays down, is one of the best parts of the album. And when Tony starts to improvise over top of it at the outset of the song, and then Ozzy comes in on vocals, It's really one of the great moments of this record, and I think one of the great moments of their career. Sadly, the rest of this tune is kind of inconsistent because it becomes a series of extended Tony jams that sound, I mean, I think by the time you get to the section which is heavy on reverb, you start to think, okay, Tony is just going through every guitar tone that he has. I love it because I'm used to it and because it's part of this album, which I love, but it is excessive. Well, what to say about Black Sabbath's debut? I'll keep it simple. It's a masterpiece. It's one of the most influential rock and roll albums of all time. It succeeded despite the strong headwinds of the opinion of the mainstream music press, for whom anything which fell short of CSNY or the Beatles was some kind of heresy, and is, as one critic noted, the album which eats hippies for breakfast. 5 out of 5.